So this is a unique book in Scripture for a lot of different reasons, but one of the main ones that we see, what is completely unique about the book of Esther as opposed to every other of the 65 books in Scripture? No mention of God's name at all. He's completely absent from the book. But is he absent from the book? Obviously, we see him every step of the way, and we've seen it at this point. So one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is when sometimes in our lives we get to the point where we think, this is not how I thought that it would turn out. And maybe things happen, whether it's at home, or whether it's in your job, or a relationship, or with your kids, and we get to this point where we think, that's not what was supposed to happen. That doesn't gel well with my plans and my purposes. And sometimes we look at these things so on the surface that we ignore that there is a God behind the scenes working things, like he says in the book of Romans chapter 8, all things working together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So we're going to see that today. We're going to see some events transpire in this story that you think that's not supposed to happen. Like things like that are not supposed to happen to a believer. You shouldn't. These kind of things we shouldn't have to struggle with, and we see this all the time. There are things all around the time. So when we first moved to Clayton, in between the time that I was voted on there and when we moved there about 3 or 4 weeks later, one of our deacons, the head of our deacon board, his house burned down. There was some wiring in his house that wasn't done properly, and it completely burned down. He lost everything. So insurance paid a little bit of it, but not a lot. And so we came back we moved there with that kind of looming over his family and over his situation. And there's times I think, why did that happen? Lord, out of all things, like he is faithful, one of the most faithful people I have ever seen in the church. Like sometimes, some Sunday nights we have 2 or 3, where 2 or 3 are gathered. That's my goal, right? And he would be one of those 2. He was there turning on lights and setting coffee pots to go. He was the one. It's like, why do these kind of things happen? And sometimes we so focus on our circumstances that we forget that behind the scenes there is a Lord, a God, a Master who is working all things toward his purposes. There has never been a moment in human history, in Scripture, or in our lives when God has taken his hand off of you. And he looks and says, uh-oh, I don't know what to do now. Like, you've really dug yourself into a pit. I don't know how you're going to get out of this. We're going to see that kind of situation here where God, it seems on the surface like things are spiraling out of control. But behind the scenes, we're going to see that God never lost control of the situation. So, at this point in the story of Esther, we've met most of the main characters. We're going to meet the rest of them tonight. We met at the beginning a man named King Ahasuerus. I'll tell you this. Let's frame it in this way. Next year we'll be voting on our president again. We'll be voting on who we want to take the head office of our nation. If King Ahasuerus was running for office in America, would you vote for him? Would he have your endorsement? Now, why? If not, right off the bat, he didn't know how to control himself. So he was a drunkard. What else? Tell me about this guy. Terrible advisor. The cabinet that he built was absolutely the worst. In fact, in some situations, it looks like he's being held hostage by these terrible advisors that he's gathered. But he was the one who chose them. What else? Why wouldn't you vote for a man like this?
I don't know if you mentioned this, but I think when he was coming back from Greece or something, it was a water passage or something that he didn't win over. He took a whip and he beat the water. That was going to do something.
You know what that sounds like? It's like a child, right? Doesn't get their way. Well, I'm just gonna act out and throw a tantrum in the middle of this. So he came back from Greece utterly humiliated. I mean, he had taken an army. There's different ranges. Some people say as low as 150,000, up until some people say it would have been closer to 1 million soldiers. And he was utterly humiliated definitely by some of the warlike people of Greece, but by also some of the more philosophical areas of Greece. And so he was absolutely humiliated. The man had a horrible temper. He didn't know how to treat the people underneath him. He was terrible to women. He was a man who just gave in to his basest instincts. So that's this guy. He rules over most of the known world, but cannot rule over himself. That's kind of the picture that we get of this guy. He's prone to these wild mood swings. He goes from being, it says in chapter 1, he was merry with the wine. He was excited, he was happy, and then the next minute he's seething in anger. And we see this kind of over and over. So he's this train wreck waiting to happen. And he doesn't last very long, honestly, in this position. So we kind of see him and we see his character, and then we see two redeeming characters with Mordecai and Esther. They make the story more worthwhile. Like if Ahasuerus was the main character of this, nobody would go see that movie. They would have given it terrible reviews. Nobody would have come out for it, paid the money for it. But when Mordecai and Esther come on the scene, it kind of redeems the story. You look at and you see these people, and no, it does not mention them praying. It does not mention them reading the Torah. It does not mention them communing with God or spending time with Him. But you see the evidence of it in their lives. You see a man and a woman of integrity, of character, and of justice. And so we're going to kind of see that play out today. We're also going to see one more character. We'll meet him here at the very end. So in a miraculous series of events, Esther finds herself in a very short span of time going from a lowly, poor exile to being raised up to the highest position that anybody in the kingdom could be raised to, aside from the king himself. She's the queen of this vast land. I mean, she can command an army. She can do anything. I mean, she can command anybody to do anything. She's kind of achieved this in a space of less than 1 year. So you look at the story. Did she do this? How did she kind of politically put herself in a position to get there? Who put her there? God did. This is nothing that she did. She was taken off the street. Somebody said, you know what, you're pretty. We're gathering pretty women. Why don't you come and be a part of this? And in fact, she was almost actively working against herself. Because these women came into King Ahasuerus and they had this beautiful makeup and these beautiful wardrobes. And it says she came in with nothing. She was her. And so God orchestrated every one of these events. I've been talking about it in terms of laying out dominoes, right? Setting them all up in order to see the story play out. And I don't say that, because I talked to my dad about this recently. I don't say that flippantly. I don't say that like God is playing games with us. That's not the goal. The goal is to show that when you set up dominoes, who's in charge? The one setting them up, right? And so when you see this story, that you can see clearly that God is in charge of this. That He manages the affairs of people. The book of Daniel says that He controls the currents of human history, that He puts kings on their thrones. And that's a scary thing for us to stop and think about. Not scary, it's reassuring, but when we think about, even when it comes down to presidential elections, right? Yes, it is our duty to vote. It is our duty to vote our conscience. We should be actively a part of putting godly people in leadership. But ultimately, at the end of the day, whoever sits at the chair in the Oval Office, right, is subject to the one who sits on the throne in heaven. And so we're going to kind of see God take center stage here in this story. He's going to set the dominoes in place. So this evening, we're going to read just a short little passage, 5 verses in chapter 2 to finish up, and then 1 verse in chapter 3. But this short section is going to set the stage for the rest of the book. If you take this domino out, if you remove these 5 verses, don't do that, by the way. The Bible makes it clear what the penalty is for adding to or removing Scripture. But if you take these 5 verses out, the rest of the book collapses. If you take this out, the story cannot continue. And I know you've done this when you were a kid or whatever, and you're doing dominoes, you're setting them up, and you place one in the wrong place. Or you put it a little too far away and it falls and then the rest are still standing. That's kind of a frustrating moment, right? And I watched the story of the man who did the biggest single line of dominoes. It was hundreds of thousands of dominoes. And he put it all, and several times in the process, he would accidentally drop one or put it in the wrong place. And they had to stop it before it created this catastrophic thing. But we're going to see God in His place. He never puts a wrong domino down. He never makes a mistake. We're going to see that in these 5 verses. Okay, so let's read it. Hopefully I piqued your interest there. Esther chapter 2, verse 19. Esther chapter 2, verse 19. When you gather, I'm going to ask you to stand with me to give honor to the reading of God's holy word. Esther chapter 2, verse 19. We're just going to read through the end of the chapter, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on. It says, when the virgins were gathered a second time. I'm just going to make just a quick parentheses here. We don't know what that means. Okay? We don't know because he had already gathered the virgins once and found the queen. So we don't know why he's gathering them again. Most of the commentators point to the fact that he really enjoyed the first round and he decided, hey, let's do this again. Okay? Thinking, one Wiersbe said it's a joke to think that because he chose Esther that King Ahasuerus was now monogamous. So we know that he continued to do these lecherous things. So, but whatever that means, we don't know when they were gathered. This could have been also a part of the original choosing. We don't know. So when the virgins were gathered the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not revealed her family background or her ethnicity as Mordecai had directed. She obeyed Mordecai's orders as she always had while he had raised her. And that's in parentheses. You can kind of see that that's the author's note on here. During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance, became infuriated and planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And when Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. And when the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. And this event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. Okay, you may be seated. So that's just a short section, but I'm telling you, if you take this section out, if we skipped right to chapter 3, nothing that follows is going to happen. It all collapses, and this is the crucial, the integral part of this book. One of the things I see, the first thing I saw as I started studying through this week, the rest of the book of Esther to this point has moved very slowly. Like if you read it, it's just all details. If you go back to the beginning in chapter 1, when they describe the parties that he's thrown, it's just like, what color are the chairs? Look at the silverware. Look at all these, like, just detail after detail after detail. This little section, though, is completely different. This is action. Look at all the verbs that we see here. I'll take you back to English class. We're going way back to high school here and looking at English. So look at all these verbs. Gathered, sitting, revealed, directed, obeyed. I mean, you see this all the way throughout this section. He's just given us bullet points. So kind of the tone changes in this section. And that's actually how we're going to frame this tonight. We're going to look at it in terms of the verbs, some pairs of verbs that we see, and that's going to kind of give us the idea of these stories. The first two that we're going to look at is this: sitting and obeying. Sitting and obeying, if you're reading in your notes. Verse 19 says Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. What does that mean? Sitting at the king's gate. If you read that with Western eyes, if you just read it purely, I'm an American and I'm understanding what this means, does that not just sound like he pulled a chair up to the front gate of the castle and just sat there? And so when you read that, it's like, well, who cares where he was sitting? I sat in my recliner today. Why do we care about where he was sitting? We got to understand this with Eastern eyes. The people that originally wrote this and the people who it was written to, we got to understand the king's gate was his royal court. This is where business was transacted. This is where the business of the country, the royal affairs of this empire were conducted in the king's gate. So for him to be sitting there, it doesn't mean he's sitting on the outside looking in. It means that he is sitting in the place of a judge or an administrator or a palace official. So somewhere in the space between when Esther was chosen as queen and this moment, Mordecai has been lifted up and raised up and promoted to this place. There are definitely benefits when your surrogate daughter becomes queen of all the land. So, and if you remember before, what was he do while Esther was in the palace preparing to go to King Ahasuerus? What was Mordecai doing? Yes. Yeah, he was checking on her. What did you say? That's right. So he was going back and forth. He was wanting to hear information. He was wanting to make sure that she was okay. And now we see this. He's in the perfect place to make sure that she's okay. He has access to her in a way that he didn't have before. So he's sitting at the gate. And this is really, really important. We think, okay, well, great. Now we know where he was. What does this matter? If he wasn't here, this is like dominoes. If you take out one of them, then the next thing doesn't happen, which means the next thing doesn't happen, and the whole story falls apart. God placed him here in this specific place to accomplish a very specific thing, a very specific request in this time. And so he was keeping an eye on her. So he was sitting, and what was she doing in verse 20? Esther had not revealed her family background or her ethnicity. That's going to be important later too. As Mordecai had directed, she what? Obeyed. She did what Mordecai told her, so she obeyed. Think about it in this term. I know that obedience is a theme that runs throughout Scripture, but you need to see this. Esther was the most powerful woman in the world. She could have looked at anybody on earth at that point and said, "You're dead," and they would have carried it on. Maybe not the king himself. Who knows? But we look at this. She was so powerful. She had amassed this incredible position. And what was she doing? She was obeying her father. She looked up to Mordecai. It says that not only was she obeying him then, she had always obeyed him. This is a picture of Christ for us. Because Esther in this story represents Jesus Christ. He was willing to go even to a place of death. Remember, Esther will say later on in the story, she's going to say, even if it cost me my life, this is the moment I was made for, and she's going to do this. She represents Christ. She was obedient. And she points us to Philippians chapter 2. And listen to who we worship today. The reason why we're here today. It says, adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, who, even though he was existing in the form of God, even though he was royalty, even though he was the creator and sustainer, he did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity, and when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient. So Esther's kind of giving us a shadow of what Christ is going to do eventually. He's going to empty himself, and even though he deserved it, was made for that high position, he lowered himself in order to save his people. So Esther's obedience, it's going to save the lives of the people. And all the author is trying to do here is give us a glimpse into these people's character. Right? And I know that Mordecai is really trying to be a babysitter. You could call him, in today's terms, a helicopter parent. You know those terms where we don't let our kids go, we kind of just hover around them and make sure they don't get into anything. You don't know how many times an hour we say these words. Sophie, what did you just put in your mouth? I mean, it happens. It happens minute by minute. It's just what did you just put in your mouth? Oh, okay. Oh, wow, that shouldn't go there. And we know that babies, that's how they encounter the world. They see it first through. But that's the kind of parents that we are. And I think, how did we not die? My generation, and then especially y'all's generation, how did you survive to this point? Because you all didn't have helicopter parents. I think about it the way that I was. We would go out basically during the summer, and as soon as it was light enough to go outside, we would go outside, and we didn't come back until we heard my mom, until she got the tone. Like she would say, "Come in," and we'd say, "We got a few more minutes." And then when she got real upset, then we knew, okay, we're going to have to get. We'd be gone all day. They had no idea what we were doing, what we were up to, and we did some awful things. But now we see Mordecai in this situation. He's this helicopter parent. And what's ironic about this whole situation is that Esther is the last person on earth who needs anybody babysitting her. She is the character who shows more integrity and more character than anyone else in this story. But we see these people. He's just setting the scene for everything that's to come, sitting and obeying. Number 2 is guarding and planning. Guarding and planning. Look at verse 21 with me. During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 awful names, by the way, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance. They were literally palace guards. They stood at the gate and made sure the king was okay. They became infuriated and they planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Now, this was not unique. This was not an uncommon thing. This happened all the time. When you look at the record of the kings of history, many of them died because of an assassin. Many of them. And a lot of times, it's some sick and twisted things. If you read the stories of what happened to the Roman emperors, many of them were killed by their own family members. A lot of times, the mother would kill one of the sons in order to put one of the other sons in place. And it was this intrigue that was just ridiculous. It was to the point where I would wonder why anybody would want to be in that position. Right? And I think that same thing today in America, why anybody would want to be president of the United States. I mean, just you are guaranteeing that half of the country is going to malign you and smear you and talk bad about you for the rest of your life. I mean, Obama's not even part of the picture anymore, and yet I still see things pop up politically against him. He's like, he's gone! I mean, let's focus here. Anyway, let's not get political. This was not uncommon. This was probably very, very common. That's why we read about characters in Scripture, like in the story of Joseph and in Nehemiah, who were cupbearers. These people, their job wasn't just to serve. Their job was to taste the wine that the king was about to drink to make sure it wasn't poisoned. If he keels over dead, then the king's probably not going to take that wine. So this was part of it. That's why the king only entrusted a handful of people to have access to him personally. Now, we see this man's name, Bigthan, we see it in the record of the book of Esther before this. We see it in chapter 1. It's a slight spelling change. They call him Bigthan in the beginning, but most commentators believe this was the same person. And where was he in chapter 1? Let's find him. Look at verse 10 with me. Verse 10 of chapter 1. On the seventh day, when the king was feeling good from the wine, Ahasuerus commanded Mehumman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigthan, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who personally served him. So what this means, if we're right, I'm not going to stake my ministry on that this guy is the same guy, but most commentators believe it was. What that means is they had a snake in the hen house. They had a person in his immediate circle who had access to him daily, who had access to weapons because he guarded him, and he was right in his presence. So this was a pretty terrible thing that we're seeing right here. He had a traitor in his closest circle of counselors. Now we don't know why he was angry. All it says here, why these 2 men, all it says in verse 21 was that they became infuriated and they planned to assassinate him. We don't know why. We don't know why they were angry at him. Here's a couple of ideas that he threw out. One, they said that Queen Vashti paid them to try to assassinate him. Because she was so angry about what happened, they were close to her, and she was the one that kind of set this in motion. I think that's pretty plausible. If you guys were the jury, you might convict on that. I don't know. Then, it's kind of circumstantial though. Then, if you go deep into history, this is extra biblical, but if you go deep into history, the kings of Persia were only supposed to marry out of the 7 noble families of Persia. So for King Ahasuerus to marry somebody outside of those boundaries, that was kind of an affront to those families. So some of the commentators think he was the 7 families, kind of, oh, that sounds like the mafia, right? They paid to put a hit out on King Ahasuerus. I think we're going to see something else, because in verse 21, what's the first thing it mentions? What are we connecting to here? During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. I don't think that's an accident that's there. I think that's what's connecting the story. I think maybe he bypassed something. Maybe Mordecai was promoted and they didn't appreciate it. Either way, however we want to see this, whoever we want to convict of this crime, we got to see this. Who was the original temper tantrum thrower in this story? The king. And you got to see this, that the way that people leads down into the people below them. Often you see this in a church, that people in a church become like their pastor. For good or bad, guys. Just you guys are doing, sorry. No, but in this situation, you look at it like this. He was wild, he was unpredictable. He was a man prone to wild temper tantrums and mood swings. And what are we seeing in the people directly associated with him? We're seeing the same kind of behavior. So it kind of bled down into this thing. Leadership trickles down. And so these people become like their leader. He's proven himself that he is angry, petulant, wild, unmanageable, unpredictable. And these character traits are starting to become known in the people under him. So we've seen those 2 verbs. Number 3, learning and reporting. Learning and reporting. So they begin to plot plot. They begin to scheme. This is where every good story starts, right? There's a plot to kill the king. What are we going to do about it? Apparently, though, these guys were amateurs at this. Because they're obviously talking about it. Because where is Mordecai at this point? At the king's gate. He's in the royal court of the king. And so these guys are planning and plotting this. Obviously somewhere in a public place where anybody can hear, or not anybody can hear, because we know that God chose this specific person to hear those specific words. It says in verse 22, Mordecai learned of the plot. So, what are his options at this point? Let's just talk through. What are Mordecai's options when you learn about something like this? Let it happen. Would that have been the worst thing in the world?
Probably. Who's in line?
Yeah.
Who's the queen?
Who's in line? Okay, get it? You get spiritual. Yeah. No, you're right. So this is good. He could have let it happen. King Ahasuerus is an awful guy. At this point, did he know, after what he had done to the women in chapter 2, did he, let's be careful with this, but did he not deserve this? Do we not all deserve this? I mean, let's be honest and look at this, but Sam, you got it. You hit the nail right on the head. This was not God's plan. So Mordecai, I believe, directed by the Holy Spirit, whether intentionally he knew that or not, he said, Esther, you've got to stop this. He did the right thing. We'll call it that. So we'll frame it in terms of this. There's a president. I don't want to talk about the president now. There is a world leader that you're not real fond of, and you find out there's an assassination plot. What's the right thing to do? This should be pretty obvious. Let's report that, okay? Let's make sure that across the board we don't by proxy assassinate people, and whether it's their body or their character, right? So he does this noble thing. He says, Esther, you've got to tell. So she goes right into the presence of the king and she says, King, there's something you need to know. There is a plot against your life. All of these things are setting up, they're foreshadows for what's about to happen, because eventually Esther is going to have to come into the presence of the king again. And it's going to be a much more important thing for her personally. Mordecai is going to learn things throughout the story that he's going to need to tell Esther. All of these things are encapsulated here in these verses. So this is learning and reporting. You look at this, though, can you imagine how crazy this would be to have that kind of knowledge? Have that kind of knowledge that the king was going to be assassinated and you were the only one who could make a difference in that. Wow, the story just, to me, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes we read this and we're like, oh yeah, he saved the king's life. No, he saved the life of the most powerful man on planet Earth. This is something that he should be rewarded for this, and we're going to read a little bit later. So, number 4, let's keep going. Investigating and verifying. Investigating and verifying. Look at the beginning of verse 23. So Mordecai learned the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther. Then in verse 23, when the report was investigated and verified. Now, if we're reading typically in our own personal Bible reading, this is not a phrase that we would dwell on, right? I mean, it's okay, they looked it up, they found it out. But again, this is planting seeds for what's to come. This is really, really important, because we need to establish between the king and the rest of the people here that Mordecai and Esther are people to be trusted. We need to establish that firmly so that when Esther says something and it's proven true, now the king knows I can trust her. She cares about me. She values my life. And so this is an important thing, because without this, because normally he could have just said, you know how many death threats he probably got a day? It probably happened all the time. You know, there's an office in the White House, an office of the Secret Service, that just continually processes death threats. And things made on Facebook, and different threats made across social media and in different places. I remember a good friend of mine, he went to Washington, D.C. for some big event, and it was on 4th of July, and he was just being silly, and he wrote these words, I'm here in D.C. about to blow things up. Okay? He meant, we're about to have so much fun, the party's just going to blow things up. Okay? And a couple of hours later, and he opened the door, and it was the Secret Service. They were at his hotel room door, ready and talking to him. They had investigated him. They had done all this. It's a scary thing to say this about in this situation, but they investigated it and they reported it. And so that's what happens here. And we're going to see this is a very important thing moving forward, because now the king knows he can trust his wife. Often in history and in these times, the men could not trust their wives. They could not. Many, many, many times, kings were assassinated by their wives, which is an awful thing, right? When you think about it, you've come under the covenant of marriage to love each other, to serve each other, and to get to that point. Mindy loves to watch shows on ID, like investigative discovery, things like 2020 and 60 Minutes and some of these shows. Every time I walk in, a wife has murdered her husband. And I come in, I think, I know you love me, but are you getting tips for something? Because it seems like you're always like, she said there was a notebook. I'm taking notes, no, she's not really, but I think about this. This is a terrible thing to see, but they investigated it, they verified it, and now they know that Esther is a trustworthy person. Number 5, hanging and recording. Recording is the blank there. Hanging and reporting. This is where I want to kind of really focus in on before we end. But it says in verse 23, when the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. This is a gruesome thing. I don't really want to spend some time here with the gruesome medical details of this, but one thing that we have wrong in our Bibles, okay? We're going to be careful about saying that, but one thing we didn't get right is the translation of that word. It is not in the sense that we understand of a man in the Wild West who was hung on gallows, who was hung by his neck. All right. So when we move to Clayton, Clayton is famous for just a couple of things. It's a very small town, so it's not famous for a lot. One of them is the dinosaur footprints. There's like 3,000 dinosaur footprints fossilized in the mud. It's pretty cool. But then the other thing that they're famous for was the one and only hanging that happened in New Mexico territory. Was a man named Blackjack Ketchum. And he was a train robber and a bank robber. They caught him in Clayton and they hanged him. They had never done it before. They didn't know how to do it. And when they strung him up, they tied it too tight and they dropped him and his head popped right off. So, believe it or not, they are very proud of that. I mean, they have a museum dedicated to Blackjack Ketchum. They have all the details, the pictures and everything, and they're so proud of that fact. So that's kind of what we think when we hear the word gallows, but we're not understanding it right, because literally what these words mean is that he was nailed to a tree. That's what hung on the gallows means. Nailed to a tree. What does that sound like to you? Crucifixion. It's exactly what happened. The Persians invented it. The Romans perfected it. So what we're seeing here in this story, hidden away behind a translation that's maybe trying to be a little bit nicer about what actually happened, we're seeing that two people are paying the penalty for their sins by being crucified. And we know that one day, this is pointing us forward, that one day there's going to be a man that hangs on the cross, he's crucified, but it won't be for his sins. It'll be for the sins of the world. And we see this. I love what one author wrote here. His name is Ray Stedman. He wrote this: the principle of a cross is thus introduced as a means by which God deals with evil. So these men, they paid the penalty for their evil, but Jesus would hang on the cross one day paying the penalty for mine. That he would go through that, not because of what he had done, but because of what I had done, what we had done. So this gives us a picture of Jesus all the way back. It's 465 years before he was even born here. It's just a passing reference now. The idea of gallows, or the place of crucifixion, the place of execution, is going to show up 6 more times. So buckle up over the next few chapters. This is going to be a recurring theme. It's going to set up the kind of the idea of the story. In chapter 6, it's going to come back to light. We're going to see things come full circle. So that's the story. That's where this ends. It says this event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. So basically, he had a man, a scribe, walking with him everywhere he went, recording all the things that happened. This was Dear Diary of the king of Persia. Again, it's just a passing reference, but this is going to be very important as it comes back later in the story. But this is where it ends. What a weird way for this to end, this story. So Mordecai has all the power in the world. He saves the king's life. And then what happens to him?
Forgets about it.
Nothing. No, forgets about it. It's the same thing that happened to Joseph in prison, right? Joseph gave two interpretations of some dreams, and they came true. And then one of the men that was raised back up from prison into the king's palace, it says he forgot about it. And that's exactly what's happening here. This is the kind of situation when I stop and I think, this isn't fair. This isn't fair. Mordecai didn't have to say a word. He could have said, you know what, I'm just going to let that guy die. Then Esther is going to be in a better position, although probably not, depending on who came into power after that. But you look at this, he didn't have to do that, and he did. And he didn't get any recognition. In fact, let's read the first verse of the next chapter. Chapter 3, verse 1. After all this took place, after all this, I love that we compress somebody saving the king's life into. After all that, King Ahasuerus honored who? Haman. His name is spelled Mordecai. Who's this Haman guy? He honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He promoted him in rank and gave him a higher position than all the other officials. This seems completely backwards. When you look at this story, you got to be like, what's happening here? Mordecai was the one that saved your life, and now you're promoting Haman. Who's Haman? Where did he come from? And we have the tendency, I have the tendency to bristle at this. I got to say, when I was in seminary, I hated when we would do group projects. I don't know about you, I hated group projects because I felt like I did all the work, and then kids would come, and they didn't do anything, and they would come on presentation day, and they would get a grade. And it's like, you didn't do anything. But I'm not going to be a snitch. I'm not going to tell on them. And so I bristle at this idea that Mordecai was ignored and forgotten, and this man named Haman had nothing to do with this, was lifted to the top. But we have got to see something here. If Haman wasn't lifted to the top, then Esther would not have been needed. This is God putting dominoes in place. He's sovereignly working all things into His will and His purpose. The people of Israel wouldn't have been saved if Haman wouldn't have been in this position. And in our lives, we're frustrated that something's not working out the way that we thought that it would. I want us to stop and I want us to think back on this story and say, you know what? Maybe in my job, maybe Haman's being promoted, and that just means something's about to happen where Mordecai is about to be honored. Because we're going to read in chapter 10 later on in this. Mordecai is given a parade. Mordecai is lifted to the very top. He's called the greatest man that Israel had ever seen. We're going to watch that. So maybe when we look at things in our life that aren't turning out the way that we thought, we think, you know what? This is Haman's time, but my time of blessing is coming. And you know, honestly, we look at this and we don't even expect that, do we? When you look at your life, is my life going to be spent in pursuit of seeking blessing? You know what? If you've been in one of the Sunday school classes over the last couple of weeks, we've been reading the book of Ephesians. And one of the things Ephesians chapter 1 tells us is that we have been blessed with all the spiritual blessings of heaven in Christ Jesus. We have all the blessings that we need. But God is going to honor them. I love what Warren Wearsby said. This is where I'll end. Our good works are like seeds planted by faith. Their fruit doesn't always appear immediately. So God's doing something. You know, the king may not have seen what Mordecai did, but who saw it? God did. God sees this. Nothing is wasted. No good work is wasted. No good thing that you do in Christ's name is wasted. He said, if you give a cup of cold water to someone in need, it might as well have been given it to Christ himself. And so we're going to see this kind of play out. Mordecai and Esther, what they had to do is they had to trust in the Lord, that he was going to make all things right. And that's my encouragement for us tonight as well. When you trust in God, you trust in two different avenues. His power that he can make all things right, and his goodness that he's promised us that he make all things right. We need to do the same today. Let's pray, and we will be finished tonight. Father, I thank you for this story. It bothers me, Lord, in this situation that Haman was lifted and honored instead of Mordecai. But I know the end of the story. That Mordecai would be honored, Lord. And I know that teaches us the same thing in our lives. When things aren't turning out the way that we thought they would, we know that the end of all things we will stand before you in the New Jerusalem, in your kingdom, and enjoy all the benefits of your presence. That's going to make these things that we suffer through now pale in comparison, Lord. We won't remember being passed up for promotions. We won't remember our kids fleeing for a time as prodigals. We won't remember the suffering or the pink slips or the diseases or the divorces. Lord, we won't remember the things that afflict us when we know that we're with you forever. And I pray that you remind us of that you've given us all spiritual blessings, that you've poured out on us blessings in Christ Jesus that we will never, ever be able to fully even understand. We're so grateful to you, Lord. Thank you for the story that in multiple ways points us forward to Jesus Christ. Thank you for what he did for us on the cross, that he hung on that cross. He was hung on those gallows, in the language here in Esther chapter 2, Lord, for my sins. He was bruised for my transgressions, and the punishment for my peace was upon him. I'm so grateful, Lord, for our Savior Jesus who gave his life for me. I pray that each day we would live our lives as Mordecai and Esther, Lord, in a deep sense of that identity, that I belong to Jesus, Lord, and I am yours and you are mine. I thank you for this church and pray that you bless them for their faithfulness in being here on a Sunday night, Lord. So many things they could have done, but I don't believe they're here by accident. I think you have something for them in the same way that you had Mordecai exactly where you wanted him, Lord, in the story of Esther. We love you. We dedicate this